To begin, we talked about addressing our challenges using community-engaged and community-based policy. And if you all are X folks or Twitter folks or whatever that is, please connect with me on there. Again, I want to invite you to reach out over time if you have questions or thoughts or comments. Let's go to the next slide. So I talked about that elephant in the room. That elephant in the room is that the United States has an inequitable system on purpose. I don't know how many of you have been to Iceland or Europe, Finland. When you go to these countries, the experience is completely different because our country is built on inequality, like literally built on it. The reason why school district lines look the way they look and haven't been changed in a long time is they're built on historical inequities. We want to educate these kids, but not those kids, with our funds. And even today you see districts wanting to secede from other districts because they don't want to fund other kids and they want their kids to be able to outcompete other children with more resources. That is how our system is built. We do not have an equity system like you see in Finland and other places, and that's why you don't see us have the kinds of results that equity-based countries have. It's just, it's baked in on purpose. Next slide. So this shows that poverty is intense. It's intensified. And when you drive around Houston, you see and experience that poverty. Houston is one of the cities, and I've been to many cities, I've been to 60 countries. Houston is one of those cities where the intensification and the differentials in poverty is front and center. The difference between Memorial and River Oaks is so intensely different from some of the other parts of the city. It is on full display here, right? And you can see that in Texas, historically, a majority of students live in poverty. And you can see where the poverty bands are, okay?
And not just red states.
Not just red states, no. California has a lot of issues too. Next slide. So we talked about this. So Bruce Baker, who's at, I think he's still at Rutgers, is one of the top education finance scholars in the nation. And he does a yearly report, his research center does a yearly report to help communities know about how they stack up against other states across the nation. So do you want to know how Texas stacks up against other states across the nation in terms of funding its schools? An F in the level of funding, a C in how funding is distributed, a D in funding effort. And Texas, Oklahoma, Nevada, Alaska, these are all the top quarter of states for economic growth over the last several years. And you know where? And you know what? They've also had the largest reductions in state and local resources for education. How does that work? And the thing is that a lot of these conversations are about, you know, the governor is not here right now because he's touring Asia. So, I mean, you're aware of this. This is public information, right? And I think part of what has to be known, you know, Tesla moved here, et cetera, is one of the reasons why these accountability systems come into play is because they want to be able to brag about how great the schools are in Texas to these companies that might want to consider relocating here, right? And so part of the challenge is educating people who want to move here about what's really happening with the schools in terms of how the state's making decisions about funding. So people are not going to want to come to Texas once they understand the context within which their children are going to operate, unless they live in these havens that are highly resourced, right? So this is a long-standing problem that Texas severely underfunds its schools. And then we'll take over a district because a single high school missed the test scores by just a couple of points. Changing the conversation, right? Because you don't want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about the fact that this is on purpose and structural, and they're really quite proud of this inequality. That this is okay, because Eric Hanishek will go around saying, well, money doesn't matter. But if you go to wealthy communities, you can see, how do they solve problems? They throw money at it. Wealthy people solve problems by throwing money at it. Right? When their kids run into a little something, they throw money at that problem. They buy tutors. They buy whatever the resources are that they need to. So in wealthy communities, money matters. But for middle class and low income communities, all of a sudden money doesn't matter. That seems ironic to me. Next slide. Oh, yeah, next slide. So what does this mean? What does it mean that there's a $22 billion difference between the funding for majority minority districts like Houston and majority white districts in the United States? I'm going to say that number again. That's billion with the B. There's a $22 billion difference in funding between those districts. Again, this is something that your friend might not want to talk about and might want to change the subject.
What is it different between what?
Between majority white districts and majority minority districts, there's a $22 billion difference. And you can Google that and the study will come up, right? Those are the facts. That's the reality, right? But we don't want to talk about that because we want to talk about the fact that one high school missed their test scores by just a couple of points, right? That's really what we should be talking about here today. Oh, wait, not yet. So you see that states with low funding levels tend to have less competitive teacher wages. Texas typically ranks in the bottom quintile nationally. Less competitive teacher wages leads to higher turnover, according to peer-reviewed research. Now, my friends that say that money doesn't matter believe in markets. They believe that pay and benefits are going to attract teachers to the job, right? That's what they tell us, right? That pay matters for teaching. They actually don't say that. Like, we throw markets out the window when we talk about educators. Working conditions and pay. No, teachers are going to do it just because they care. No, they have families. They have kids they want to send to college. So we know that as a part of market theory, that teachers have to be compensated. They have to have strong working conditions. These are things that matter, which lead to problematic retention. And hiring less or underqualified or fully underqualified teachers to fill these positions is not the path to a successful district. It's teachers that are central. We can all think of a teacher that was incredibly impactful in our life, right? But these kids, I hear stories from kids when I've done research projects in the past. They understand that the teachers that they have today are probably not the teachers that are going to be there next year. Because 50-60% of teachers in hard to staff schools turn over every year. And that is a problem with the discontinuity of learning and the mentorship of our students. Because it's like that old song, there's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, which is that we're okay with teachers turning over rapidly, leaving schools because we're not properly compensating them, we're not properly supporting them, we're not providing them high quality leadership. The research tells us all the reasons why teachers leave schools, and it's not just pay, there's a variety of things. But my friends that say that money doesn't matter to districts are not willing to acknowledge that there are things that matter to our teacher workforce as a profession. So the series of reports is called Making the Grade, Is School Funding Fair? Found that unfair funding patterns are consistent across indicators, meaning that students with unfair school funding are likely to experience a deprivation of resources. Money does matter. And it matters for our middle class kids, our working class kids, students who have less economic resources. It matters. But that's not a conversation that some people want to have, and they want to change the subject. Next slide, please. So people don't want to have to justify their privileges. They don't want to have to justify having access to power and resources. And by not talking about it, they're able to hold on to their power without being questioned. But you all are in this room because you are questioning this system, this inequality on purpose. And so, thank you for that. Next slide. So, there's a film on Netflix. It's called Requiem for the American Dream. And Noam Chomsky describes the historical context of top-down reform and less democracy in public policy. So, there was a woman that came up to me after. She said, Julian, I've been to these other conferences other conversations about healthcare and other things. And what I found is that the themes are very similar on what's happening in healthcare and education and other places. Same themes of control, of privatization, of limited opportunities for people of different backgrounds. These are the conversations that are not just happening in education, they're happening across our society because there is a playbook. And it's a historical playbook. In fact, when there was a coup, now you're like, why is Julian talking about a military coup? When there was a military coup in Chile, they brought some academics from the University of Chicago, including Milton Friedman, who I mentioned earlier. And the new dictator said, I really don't want government to pay for education in the way that it has before. I think it's a private good. What should I do? What were these academics' answer? Vouchers. So every student in Chile got a voucher because a dictator said, I don't really want education to be a public good and I want to be able to control and manage it. And so every kid has had a voucher in Chile for decades. So we know lots about vouchers and their failures. Lots. Lots about it. And the governor here is calling special sessions because he wants a voucher program. We know that that was the #1 priority of a dictator. That is where this came from. We know that the person who invented vouchers did it because he didn't believe that schools should have to be segregated after Brown versus Board. These things have sordid histories that a lot of us didn't know before. A lot of us didn't know that that vouchers, this school choice mechanism, was created to foment inequality. But yet they have sought to reframe school choice as about civil rights. And then we wonder why charter schools are more segregated. I'm just keeping it real here, okay? We wonder why. The reason why is because these policies are actually created to foment inequality. That's what they weren't. This whole conversation about civil rights and how could you possibly not want this kid to have this option, all of that reframing doesn't change that they're trying to put lipstick on a pig. Next slide, please. So how does this less democracy look in education policy, in education reform? Okay, so school choice, vouchers, etc. are neoliberal reforms that seek to address inequality. Now, for those of you, neoliberal, for some folks, is like, what does that mean? It simply means that how do we privatize and profit off the backs of children in education? That's the bottom line here. We don't want all the money to go to the education of the children. We want some of that to go into our pocket. That's what we're talking about here. Okay. Let no disaster go to waste. Government decisions to address COVID after Hurricane Katrina. Why fix a social problem when we can monetize it? Executive actions and state-based actions targeting marginalized communities. We talked extensively about some of those policies and practices, different legislative movements this morning, so I won't go deep into that one. The Standards Common Core Accountability and High Stakes Test. We talked about that, how that was an outgrowth of No Child Left Behind and how that functioned in the stratification of opportunity for students. I remember when I was at Texas, I'm going to tell this one quick story. I remember when I was at Texas, the TOS was long gone and we were in the tax. I think that's what it was, the tax? After TOS was tax, right? I think it's that. Yeah. TOS was long gone, and I had high schools telling me that 10 years later they had folks still trying to come to the high school to pass the TOS because they were determined to graduate from high school. And that broke my heart. Every year people trying to pass the TOS, 10 years after it went away so they could get their high school diploma. Because high stakes tests in their current form actually come from China. How many of you knew that? So they came from China because, and I was just in China a couple of weeks ago and they were talking about this. What they used to do, and still do somewhat with the way the system operates, but I won't go into all that, is they would give these elite exams all across China. And then based on how you did that exam, you'd be called in to do another exam. And then they would put people into positions of leadership and power based on how they do this exam. It's a sorting mechanism. In the old days in China, based on how you did on the college exam, they would tell you where you would go to college and then they would pay for it. Now it's a little different system nowadays, but these are stratifying mechanisms. You first saw them come to light in the United States during the wars, when they wanted to decide who was going to be an officer and who would go to the front line and have the most risky jobs. So this is the history of these exams. It's never been about, can I give a kid this exam and identify whether we need to provide them more support and spend more resources on them? No, these are stratifying mechanisms. And the Greek talked about the noble lie, that society must be sorted into gold, silver, and bronze. This is a concept that goes back thousands of years. And so what tests actually do is they're sorting mechanisms. We are not giving you a high school degree because you didn't pass one of these 15 tests. You only passed 14 of them, right? And so they're justified as, well, we don't have high enough standards, or look at this failing school. They're used as sorting mechanisms in society to ensure that certain people don't have long-term economic success. So again, I point you to the blog. Lots of conversations about this. Next slide. So all this is kind of upsetting. I get that. So now I'm going to pivot a little bit and say, here's what we do instead that are the gold standards. What we know from research literature will work and is community focused, community engaged, rather than letting people in Austin decide what happens in Houston or DC. Here's how you do community engaged work. So what I'm going to do is on the next slide, on the left side, oh, not yet. A little more context. No, let's stay here. So I'm a scholar, so I have to give you the theoretical framework, right? So this is the framework of thinking about community engaged policy, right? So we've been dealing with this dominant paradigm of top-down private control and privatization. Despite vocal opposition from everyone in this room and communities, they are full speed ahead. So top-down hierarchical models ostracize community alternatives. The community is purposely ostracized in these approaches. You don't know what you're talking about. Look at this test score that we have. We're so capable. We know more than you know. This is very consistent. You don't just see this in Houston. You saw this in New Orleans. You saw this in Oakland. You saw this in Philadelphia. It's a classic playbook. The community doesn't know what it's talking about, and you're actually the reason why this is happening. And we have come to save you and make a little money on the side while we do it. More research in the area bring to the forefront of the effective models of community engagement. Professor Warren out at Battle Creek has Boston College, has talked about how we do community engaged work. So over the past 20 years, community organizing has emerged as a powerful form of public engagement in education policy in response to the education reform movement that's focused on top-down, external, privatized models. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. I was going to talk about some examples there, but we got to keep moving so we have time for questions. So on the left, you see here how you do top-down private control and privatization for a set of approaches to solving issues that we have in education. On the right is how we can do this work within community control. Okay? So we have value-added teacher evaluations, which were found to be illegal here in Houston several years ago, but that doesn't stop them from continuing to use them. Peer assistance and review is where expert teachers evaluate expert teachers. So you have expertise rather than someone like me sitting in office looking at the difference in the residual change between an average, this is what value-added models do, an average and your actual score and what the residual difference is between those 2 points, right? Actually having people evaluate teachers, expert teachers doing that work. So that's a community engaged way to understand teacher quality and how teachers are doing within the context of other experts. This is how we do it in higher education. There's not someone that sits in a room and calculates a statistical model whether I'm a good professor or not. What we do is our peers evaluate our work, and they're experts. And so they tell us if we're doing well in what we do. So that's the tenure process, and then some universities have it as an ongoing process too. But our tenure process is our peers, our experts that understand what we do, evaluating our portfolio. And so as educators we do it that way, and K-12 educators should receive that same respect. Teach for America, and I'm not going to have anybody raise their hand who was Teach for America back in the day or how you feel about it. But there are university district partnerships. I gave you an example, and we're talking about the teacher shortage here. I gave you an example of how we now have 1,000 educators through a Grow Your Own. So one time I was giving a lecture at the Northeastern Law School, and somehow Suri started listening to my lecture, and she says right in the middle of the presentation really loud, "Professor Julian, this is too many words." And everybody just died laughing. I was like, good job. I didn't know you could be funny, sorry. There are charters that are privately managed. These are managed by for-profit and non-profit. In California, for example, for-profit charters are illegal. But there are ways that you can do in-district charters. You can think of them as similar to like magnet schools that are controlled by the district, and so they are directly democratically accountable. Now, charter supporters don't typically like those approaches because then that means that they don't control the resources of the schools. But within there are ways that you can do in district charters. That's how they originally envisioned as laboratories of innovation for educators, not laboratory of innovations for outsiders. School district takeover closure portfolio districts. I don't think I need to say anything about this because you all are real world experts on what's happening with this. But community schools and community districts are an alternative to this approach. Community schools, I was on the community schools task force for NEA a few years ago. It's actually a model. It's not the schools sit in the communities. There's a whole set of things, including coordinators with services, coordinating with local nonprofits and others to address the needs. It's a model, and as the research is emerging, has been really strong for the success of students and the happiness and contentment of families with their schools. High stakes assessment, we talked a little bit about that. Texas has been forefront on testing kids and wasting a lot of time and money testing kids, but there are formative and summative local assessments of how students are doing and how they're performing. Nobody knows more about the achievement of your student than their teacher. I guarantee you that. Pearson has no idea compared to the educator in that classroom about how the student is doing. And then there's top-down NCLB style accountability. This is somewhat been abated with ESSA because there's a lot more flexibility there. People are still, thrashing around trying to figure out. There are people out there right now in DC trying to bring NCLB back. Like new is old again. Oh, No Child Left Behind.
Oh, No Child Left Behind.
So testing, standards, test to graduate. Like there are people in DC right now, I was there a couple weeks ago, they're like, this would be a great idea if we did this. And I said, that's what we did 20 years ago. It's like we've been there. We were not fully proficient by 2014. In fact, we went the other direction compared to countries in most states. We do have states, I don't know if you know this, we have states that perform as well as countries. Like New Jersey, New York, they perform right up there with Korea and Finland. There are states that perform as good as countries if you do crosswalk between the NAEP and the TIMSS data, which is the international assessment and a national assessment, and you crosswalk them. Some of our states perform as well as countries. So there are states that are just knocking out the park, right? Knocking it out the park. Massachusetts is another. And there are states like Texas that are, bottom quintile. So. Now, community-based accountability. There are ways that you can do community-based accountability. We actually came up with this idea back in 2012, which is how can communities get together and set the standards and strategy for the district. Wait, what did I just say? That communities actually set the strategy and goals for the district? I know, that just blows our mind that that is actually a thing, because this stuff is always top down. Superintendent, the board, they tell us what's going to happen, and we're like, what? That's not going to happen because you're not really committed to that. So in California, I gave this idea to Linda Darling-Hammond, and this community-based accountability in the LCAP and LCFF is the law for every student. So it's actually happening right now, and it has been for a decade, which is that communities get together and set strategic plans, and they receive extra resources from the state of California to pay for things in their strategic plan. So I'll give you a specific example. So restorative justice instead of disruptive discipline and disparate discipline for black and brown boys. So there, Oakland, Long Beach invested several $100,000 in restorative justice coordinators and set the goal that they wanted to cut their suspensions in half, and they did it. And they did it because that was instead of thinking about like what's this test score going to be, we want to make sure that we can address because life happens for kids. Not everybody comes from stable situations, as we know. Kids are homeless, single parent, their parents are working, they're raising, there are so many circumstances out there that make this work so challenging. And so these districts said, you know what, achievement matters to us, but making sure those kids are in attendance and are not kicked out is also a priority, and so we're going to put resources into that. And we're going to set goals for ourselves. We want to cut this in half in 5 years. And so these are that's the kind of, and then there was another district, I think Long Beach, that said we want every kid in elementary school to have a musical experience. And so we're going to put resources into that. So this allows communities to come together and do that strategic work together. And it's required by law that communities are a part of that strategic work. So this is not pie in the sky. When I first came up with this idea in 2012, everybody's like, oh, this is pie in the sky. Well, California did it and has been doing it for 10 years. And the High Performing Coalition, which existed about a decade ago, did some of this work. Now, there's some people here that in Texas that call it something different than community-based accountability, but when I originally coined the phrase, it's how can communities do the accountability work rather than someone like me sitting in office at TEA saying, I think, and this is a real story from Houston. HISD, so as you know, I worked in research and accountability, and I have no problem giving up all the secrets now. And so when I was I was responsible for Houston's accountability system. Remember, everybody got a rating? High performing, low performing, et cetera. Remember those days? So the superintendent's office, Rod Page, or whoever, made up what they want the levels to be. And now this is a question that you have to ask yourself. Why is a rating at the level that it's at? It has no empirical basis. It's arbitrary and political. I'll give you an example. So the situation at Wheatley, I think it was at Wheatley with the test scores, they just made that up. It's not based on anything empirical or whatever, so when they say something is low performing, why? Why is that number low? Why is a 70 low or 50 or 60? They just make it up. So it's arbitrary. And so I received instructions from the district to create the categories for high performing, low performing, etc. It was 4 categories, I think. I think it was 4. And so I set it up, I sent it back to the superintendent's office, and it came back in an hour. And they're like, there's too many low performing schools on this list. Now I'm going to talk about the 3 little bears. So you know the story of the 3 little bears. There's the porridge that's too hot, the porridge that's too cold, and the porridge that's just right. So this was porridge that was too hot. There was too many low performing schools on this list for us to release it to the public. Okay? So then I went back and it's like, type. Sends it back up to the superintendent's office. There's only 3 low performing schools on this list. We can't possibly tell the public that HISD only has 3 low performing schools. Julian, get back to work. Okay. I don't remember how many schools ended up on the list, but my 3rd try was the porridge that was just right. And that's what you have to ask, like, why am I sitting in an office making up what's low performing? It's arbitrary and political because it all depended on what they wanted to put in the Houston Chronicle that year. Now, one more story about this. After the TOS results came out in 2000, HISD's results, and you can see this, went up 2 or 3 points in everything. And I was like, scratching my head because I was responsible for writing the TOS report for the district and releasing it, and then they would write their press release, whatever. And I just sat there thinking to myself, well, what have we really done this year that would cause the scores to go up 3 points? It is 2000. I couldn't figure it out, so I didn't think much else about it. But then I was in graduate school, and then someone sent me an article from the Houston Chronicle. Houston Chronicle found out that TEA had decided that instead of having to pass 7 questions in a particular section, that you only needed to pass 4 questions or 5 questions in a particular section to be proficient, right? Because we're always talking about, like, are you proficient, are you on grade? Well, how do you decide that? Like, what's the number of questions that you have to answer correctly to be proficient? And so in an election year, because 2000 was an election year, TEA had decided, because the test was so much harder that year, that you could answer less questions correct to be grade proficient on the test that they control in Austin. Arbitrary and political. So several years after the fact, because I had just been sitting at my desk just like thinking to myself, wow, we did great this year. And then when I got that article from, I think it's from Linda McNeil, God rest her soul. She was such a wonderful person. She was at Rice for a long, long time. If you don't know her work, please take Linda McNeil. Linda McNeil, she was just wonderful, inspirational to me in this work. So I need to raise her up.
Did you say her name?
Linda McNeil. Let me speak her name. McNeil. She was Rice University, and I remember one time CBS was in our building, and we were told explicitly by the superintendent's office, do not talk to 60 Minutes and do not talk to Linda McNeil. And then I thought to myself, I really need to talk to Linda McNeil. That's who I need to talk to. But you know, if you cross them, I can tell all the stories now because HISD can't touch me. If you cross them, they would fire you, take your badge, and take away your computer. I saw that happen to 2 of my colleagues. And I've recently heard that 2 of the people in research and accountability recently resigned. So you have to understand, these are oppressive conditions that were sometimes put upon us because of the politics of that time, right? We were told explicitly when Rod Page was up for secretary, we were not to talk to the media, right? And I was a team player, so I did not. But now that it's 20 years later, I can kind of give you these inside stories about what was actually happening and why it was happening. Okay, so just a couple of side stories. Next. I think we're running short on time. I can talk about how universities and communities can work together and how the scholarly community can really be of service in this work. Like I said, there are some professors that are afraid because that's the goal of these policies, is fear. And Obama once said, hope is stronger than fear. And so a lot of this work is engaged in fear and fear mongering. But hope is a much stronger emotion. And so there are professors, I'm going to be honest with you, that are fearful. But there are a whole bunch like me who are not fearful and who will work with you and engage with you and provide expertise as you see fit. Okay, let's keep going. I think we have one last quote right at the end. Yeah, we'll skip this one too. And then we'll get to questions. Next one? Next one? Yeah, one more, Megan, please. So education empowers Americans as seekers and speakers of truth. We must retain democratic control of our schools to protect the intellectual compass of our democracy. Yep. So, thank you. Please take that guy off of there, because he looks young and I look old. So let's move. Okay. So let's go to questions, thoughts, questions that are actually comments. We can do all of those. Yeah. Go ahead.
One that I tell you, oh, you're badass. You know, in Project 2025,
yeah.
I believe it's around page 105. Somebody told me I read it already.
Yeah.
But they want to have high school students take that military exam. In HISD, F. Mike Miles is turning Cullen Middle School, which is in my neighborhood, a black neighborhood, into a military academy.
I believe it.
So Mike Miles, for y'all, is following Project 2025.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that there's a lot to worry about Project 2025. But what you should really be worried about is Chevron. Now you're asking me what the heck are you talking about, Julian? But there was 2 really big Supreme Court cases that folks are not paying attention to. Let me tell you, one is that they made homelessness basically illegal. Yes. So I can't remember which case the homelessness one was, but basically cities, municipalities, counties can say you can't be outside in a public space at night, camped. So that's basically, and there's a financial incentive for them to do that, right? Which is the prison industrial complex. So that's the first one. Okay, that's the first one. The second one is Chevron. So what Chevron said, so let's say you're the EPA, you're the U.S. Department of Education. You are responsible for making sure that for-profit colleges don't rip off students. And if you look at the Corinthian colleges example, this is a very common thing that happens. I teach, for example, here in Texas, where when I was on the Professional Standards Board in Kentucky appointed by the governor, they were trying to bring their alternative certification program. When I saw their data, they had 6,000 people paying them money. Now, if I recollect correctly, there was less than 1,000 students who actually got their credential from them. So I don't think those numbers are perfect, but the bottom line here is that these for-profit companies, whether they're for teacher cert or other things, their main drive is to make sure you're enrolled in sending them money. That's the main focus of that work, right? And so what institutions, institutions, I think we can call the U.S. Department of Education an institution. What the U.S. Department of Education does is make sure that malfeasance is not happening in the education sector. And what Chevron did was, essentially, if something is not specifically in law, then you can't, it's not under your purview. So there's this conversation about abolish the Department of Education in 2000 and the 2025 project. They may have already done that. Because if it's not specifically in law, then the U.S. Department of Education probably can't enforce it. And there will be litigation for years about, because there's a whole bunch of things that we as universities do for different reasons. And so the question is, well, is this specifically in law? Do we specifically have to do this? Because if you're the EPA or the U.S. Department of Education or anybody who has a purview over activity in the U.S., it's conceivable that Chevron has literally neutered all of these education organizations unless it specifically says in law that they're empowered to do a specific thing. Now, I want to give you a little hope here, because the Supreme Court, this is just me being honest, I'm not representing anybody else's opinion or any institution. This is just my opinion. And everything I'm saying here represents my scholarship. All these cases that get set up now, they're going to take 5 years to make their way through. And so the thing is that whether it's abortion or Chevron or whatever, because the Supreme Court has become a political body, when the justices change, all of this can change back. And so what we have now set up in our country with the courts is we are going to flop back and forth. Abortion illegal, abortion not illegal. Abortion illegal, abortion not illegal. Chevron, no Chevron. Chevron, no Chevron. Because the courts were supposed to follow precedent. Because that's how people took the courts seriously and not as political bodies. But when you have the courts reversing precedents after saying Congress that they wouldn't reverse precedents, fill in whatever blank precedent you want, whether it's abortion or something else. And now that the courts are reversing precedents, what's going to happen is 5 years from now, when there's 5 Democratic justices and 4 Republican justices, and yes, I said that because that's how the courts operate now, 4 Republican, 5 Democrat, then it's all going to flip back on its head. And so now we're going to be flipping back and forth and back. So for a few years, abortion is going to be legal. Then it's not. Then it is. Then it's not. Then it is. Because the courts have now become this political place, and I think that's really bad for our democracy. It's really, really bad for our democracy. It's bad for our economy. It's bad for our young people. It's a real problem that we are not talking about enough. Yes?
So, as you talk about the switch from one group leading versus the next group leading, I'm always just so confused in what we're going through as a district, because we are a decentralized district, right? That's like nothing has been stated where we're not.
Okay.
By law, and by law, local and at the officer level, we're supposed to have shared decision-making committees in place to do certain things.
Yeah.
But when I go out and I talk to people in the community, even our elected board members, they say things like, I don't like that policy, and nobody is being held accountable for following that. It's just like we're making it up. We're making it up too, because we're not holding them accountable for what's written.
Yeah.
And so they're able to me,
Yeah.
I could be wrong, maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah.
But it looks like we're fighting a beast. It doesn't even have to exist because there are laws that we can hold people accountable to.
So let me tell you something. So I'm gonna use a dating example. So all of us have probably been on a date at some point in our life, getting to know somebody, right? And now you're thinking, why is Julian talking about this? But here's why. If someone has to tell you that they're kind and intelligent and a wonderful human being, are they really that? Like, you should know by their actions who they are, right? So if you have to tell me that our district is decentralized and then you're confused about whether that's actually the case, if you were dating that person, would you believe them? And so the thing is that people say things are decentralized so that they're not held accountable for the bad decisions that they're making behind the scenes. Oh, we're decentralized, we're local. That's not how Houston is operating. It's literally the opposite of what's happening. Everything is being driven out of Austin. That is the opposite of decentralization. The little opposite. So if someone has to tell you they're smart, intelligent, and kind, it's clearly not the case.
But what are we? I think I'm confused as to what umbrella, I mean.
This is a district where the strings are being pulled from Austin. That's what's happening here. Behind the scenes, the governor and all of those folks are the ones responsible. But if you say you're decentralized, then guess who gets blamed? The schools get blamed. Because it turns out that there's never been a case of a school district takeover that was successful, ever.
So so can I ask another question?
Sure.
Why are we fighting each other? Why are we fighting? I mean, I get him seeing whoever he is, but like, maybe everybody in this room can answer. Why are we going to Austin like every day? Because that's where the problem lies. I mean, the problem lies where our state representatives right here in front of us who are smiling and who are doing, I mean, why don't we start now letting them know that we're not going to take it anymore?
So here's the thing. True power hides. Okay? The billionaires are not sitting in this room. The folks that are donating the dark money so that this happens, they're on their ranches out by Laredo right now, writing checks and shooting vice presidents in the tail. True power hides, right? So Mike Miles is not the person in charge of this district.
Morath and Abbott?
Those strings go all the way to Austin. And it's not just this situation, it's all of these situations. Yeah.
I have a question kind of related to that, and it's a big question. I don't know if you can answer it, but Mike Miles has created a narrative, the TAs. It's baked in all the business leaders in Houston, Greater Houston Partnership. They're all fully on board.
Of course they
And
are.
some of us have access to some of those people, and I am wondering, how do you get them to care about, like, so there's so much stuff that we talked about today that they don't care about, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so do you know what the silver bullets are to get them to care?
Yeah. Some of them care about the facts, but you have to understand that these folks are fed a narrative. So in El Paso, there's a similar type of organization called CREED. Anybody heard of CREED in El Paso? CREED? So what they do is they gather all the business leaders together and they feed them a line of bullshit. Okay? And so you have to penetrate, and I talked about this in there, there are some people that are going to be willing to listen to the facts, right? Because a lot of people are on the charter train and drinking the Kool-Aid, but then they started to hear the facts, right? Once it was something on This Week Tonight, people started to hear the facts, right? And I'm not besmirching anybody in here who's Teach for America. Teach for America was the darling of the educational reform movement and the stormtroopers of charter schools, right? But people started to learn the facts, and then people even within Teach for America started to question what was happening, right? And so you have to understand that though people in that room have been fed a narrative, and so you have to counter that narrative with actual facts and research. And some will listen, And some are just in it because they want to make deals and business deals, and so they're all going to be like, yeah, let's do this. And they want to be able to say, Houston is a great place for education, and we're doing something, and here's what we're doing. And so you have to penetrate that with the facts. You're not going to get all of them because of their focus. Okay, how much time do we have? We might have to do speed questions.
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking on that, I used to have wonderful access when I was in grad school to a wide variety of research studies. I tried to go to the Houston Library, and there's obviously a paywall there. JSTOR has some things, Google Scholar has some things, but one of the problems that I'm seeing is I know studies exist. I've read them, but to access them is very difficult. So do you have any suggestions on how sort of everyday citizens can access those journals and those studies that
email
those facts?
Whenever you find a study you want, email the author, they'll send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, just say, hey, I really want to read this. Could you send me a PDF? Click, click, boop, you got it. Yeah.
So I love the idea of partnering with professors and universities.
Yeah.
But here in Texas, we now have a lot of pressure being put on our schools. Like Patrick tried to get tenure eliminated, for example, and that failed. I just know here in HISD specifically, we had a professor in education department pull out of teaching a class of student teachers because his students had been assigned to HISD schools. And his students were coming to him complaining, and he said, I'm not teaching this class. So instead of U of H supporting their professor, they just assigned another professor to that group of students and kept those kids in those NES schools where they were not receiving appropriate training. So I wrote letters to the dean of the School of Education and fell on deaf ears. I got like a BS response from that effort. But what can we do as advocates here in Houston to try and get our local universities on board with fighting this takeover?
So I know the dean, I know Kathy, so I'm not going to criticize her. I've known her for decades. There's reasons why an institution would act that way, and it's a much longer conversation than here. But I think what you have to do is you have to find the allies, right? Being a dean in an institution like U of H is difficult because there are certain relationships that you're responsible for keeping. So you got to find the allies at U of H that are going to work with you. You got to find the allies at UT that are going to work with you. I can think of some at UT right off the top of my head. Terrence Green. You all know Terrence Green? You should know him.
You said UT?
UT. So there's several faculty that you all probably don't know exist that would be more than willing to work with you. And when communities come to us and say, hey, we need you, we're there. Like, I'm here today, right? Yeah. Like, yesterday was a nightmare travel day for me, and I'm not going to go through all that, but I'm here. I'm here. So there are a lot of folks that are ready and willing to work with you and that are not afraid. Because I'm going to tell you what, if Patrick makes tenure illegal in Texas, do you know how soon your best professors with the biggest grants that are run those universities are going to come to me?
I know.
So
I'm very worried.
Lieutenant Governor Patrick, if you abolish tenure, we're going to have a field day recruiting your faculty at all the other institutions. And our research portfolios are going to grow enormously. And it's going to also be a big problem for your athletic departments, which I know is something you care about here in Texas. Yeah.
On your slide with the opposites, basically, you had the two columns. I have one I was wondering about. So Mike Miles and some of those come from the same cloth, are roadies, if you will, and Chiefs for Change and all those.
Yeah.
What's the opposite?
I call them the cabal.
The cabal. What's the opposite? Because I feel like every time I'm like, oh, this guy's legit, and he's got Chiefs for Change on that board. He's Brody. I'm like, where's the legitimacy?
So there's a whole cabal. They're all connected. There's a network analysis of this. If they're a University of Kentucky Cooperative Superintendency Program graduate, that's who you want.
University of Kentucky?
Well, I'm Texas.
Texas.
Yeah. So if they have university credentials, Those are the folks you want.
But then the Brodies are associated with Yale, so I feel like.
True, that's true.
How did that happen?
Well, that should be here's my,
just a carve out for that?
this is my opinion. That's a scarlet letter.
For them?
You know what you're going to get with the Brody, because they've been inculcated in a particular perspective on how to do leadership. And so there are many, many other education leadership doctorates out there. And so being a Brody to me should be a scarlet letter. And it should always be a non-starter for leading a district, because they are positioned in their cabal to get these jobs, and that's why you always get them.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of EDDs, PhDs, ed leadership doctorates that are prepared. So when they bring you Brodies, as a community, you should always say no. Always.
And I unless this happened here, I wouldn't even know what it was.
Yeah.
And so until it happens to you, how do you fight that?
Yeah, it's all a cabal of the reforming types. But there are plenty of other options out there. But as a community, you have to organize against that. Okay, let's do a popcorn real fast. 5 seconds, what do you got?
What is specific and tangible that we could tackle? I'm talking about big picture things and the reasons, and I get that. What, I'm talking like a bond, a lawsuit, as you just stated earlier, targeting the board members. What is specific that we could walk away from here and say, I want to work on that?
Okay, 2 things. 1, you need a lawsuit from faculty to make data available from HISD.
Sorry, faculty do.
You need professors to sue HISD asking for data for research. They did that lawsuit, and
Who would take Law Center?
could in NAACP, you got to work, and let me get to that. That's related to my second point. So in New Orleans, the way they were able to keep things under wraps for such a long time was they wouldn't give anybody but Credo the data. So we were trying to study New Orleans and figure out what they were doing, and they wouldn't give us the data. As soon as we got the data, we knew what they were saying was problematic. So you got to get the data, and you need a lawsuit to force them to make sure that data is publicly available at the student level, but blinded, right? So that's the first thing. The lawsuit is you got to get the data, because that's how you get the facts. The second thing is relationships. You've got to have the proper relationships with the policymakers and the people behind the scenes, the NAACP, although NAACP Houston, back and forth. You know, I don't know where they are right now. Okay, so so the other piece is relationships. You've got to build those relationships, right? And have a strategy to do that. That's how Chief for Change and the Brodies.
Yeah.
They're all working behind the scenes on relationships all the time. Okay, having this kind of forum is a relationship forum. You know how they were asking you to talk to your neighbor? You all have to know each other, because when the times get tough, you need to be able to turn to each other. When you get burned out and say, this is never going to happen. I was telling somebody, I forget who it was, and this is the last thing I'll say. I was telling somebody, she's like, I just don't feel like this is ever going to end. And that is true. You're going to have to train your children for this fight, because people who want to profit off the backs of our kids are always going to be around. And so this is not a fight that we win, okay? But it's a fight where we can make progress and hold back the tide, because we have to train our children and their children, because there's always going to be people that believe that they should profit off our kids. And so there's a couple of thoughts there, very specific things. Make sure you get the data. You've got to have the data. 2, build those relationships externally and within this group, so that you all can be synergistic and create coalitions. The people united will never be defeated. I know many of you have been to protests. The people united will never be defeated. Thank you.
Thank you.